They say the oldest library in Rhode Island has rules. Not the ones posted on the wall behind the circulation desk, laminated and faded from years of fluorescent light. Not the ones about keeping your voice down or returning books on time. I mean the other rules. The ones nobody types up and prints. The kind that exist in the space between the shelves, in the cold draft that has no source, in the sound of something moving one floor above you when there is no floor above you. Those rules. The ones that nobody tells you about because the people who know them either stopped going back, or they can't tell you anymore. I broke one of those rules. I was alone. No one else was supposed to be there. It was a Thursday in late November, the kind of night in New England when the dark comes early and the cold has weight to it, a physical presence that presses against every window and door. I had been working for nearly 6 hours in the lower archive of the Harwick Atheneum, a building that has stood on the same coastal Rhode Island ground since 1841. I was comfortable. I was in my element. I had my documents spread across the reading table, my notes organized, my pencil moving. And then I heard footsteps. 1 floor above me. Slow, deliberate, purposeful footsteps. Moving from one end of the room to the other and back again. And here is the thing you need to understand before we go any further. There is no floor above the lower archive. There is no room. There is no space. There is only the building's original stone foundation and the ground floor above it, separated by approximately 14 feet of old timber framing and a structural gap that no architectural drawing I have ever found fully accounts for. And yet the footsteps continued. Steady. Patient. As if whatever was walking up there had been walking for a very long time and intended to keep walking for a very long time still. I sat perfectly still with my pencil hovering above my notepad and I listened. And I will tell you exactly what that felt like. It felt like being watched by something that had already decided not to rush. Before I tell you what happened in that basement archive, before I tell you about the book that opened itself, the chair that was not there and then was, the note written in wet ink beneath my coffee cup, and the shape I saw standing in the reading room when I was trying to leave, before any of that, you need to know something about the Harwick Atheneum that is not in any tourism brochure and not in any local history article I have been able to find online. The building has existed for over 180 years. In that time, 3 visitors to this library have gone what the internal records describe as unaccounted for. Not missing. Not deceased. Not relocated. Unaccounted for. That is a specific word. It is a bureaucratic word. It is a word that means something happened, but the people writing it down either didn't know what or didn't want to say. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what I am about to tell you is only the beginning. There are more stories like this one. There are more places in New England, and beyond, where the silence holds something inside it. Where the rules are not about courtesy. Where breaking them costs you something you did not know you were carrying. But tonight, we are in Rhode Island. Tonight we are in the Harwick Atheneum. And tonight I am going to tell you every rule I learned the way I learned all of them, the hard way. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why I have not gone back. Why I will never go back. And why, if you ever find yourself alone in a library, in Rhode Island, or anywhere else that feels the way this place felt, you should pay very careful attention to what I am about to say. My name is not important. What is important is what I did for a living, because it is the thing that put me in that building alone on a Thursday night in November, and it is the thing that made me a target. I want to be honest with you about that word, target, because it took me a long time to accept it. I am a historian. Or I was one in any formal sense. I spent 20 years as a local historian specializing in colonial-era New England land records, property disputes, and architectural heritage. I have worked in dozens of archives across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. I have spent entire weeks in rooms that most people do not know exist, surrounded by paper that has not been touched in a century, in total silence, utterly content. I loved it. The silence of an archive is not emptiness. It is presence. It is the accumulated weight of everything that was recorded and everything that was not. I understood that silence the way a musician understands a rest in a piece of music. It is not nothing. It is something held. That love of silence, that specific comfort I had always felt being the only living person in a room full of history, that was the thing. That was the precise quality in me that made the Harwick Atheneum notice me. I understand that now. I did not understand it then. I thought I was just a researcher doing research. 3 months before everything happened, a colleague of mine, a woman named Doris Hannigan, one of the sharpest archivists I have ever known, unflappable, meticulous, the kind of woman who double-checks her own double-checks, told me she had abandoned a research project she had been conducting at the Harwick Atheneum. I asked her why. She gave me a long look. Not uncomfortable, not dramatic. Just long and measured. And then she said, quietly, "The books moved." I laughed. Not cruelly, I genuinely thought she was making a dry joke about how disorganized the collection was. Doris did not laugh. She just looked at me and said, "I know what I saw." And I moved on. That was my first mistake. I should have asked her more. I should have asked her exactly which books, exactly when, exactly what she had been researching when it happened. I had a personal ritual in every archive I worked in. Before I stepped away from any document, even to use the restroom, even for 10 minutes, I would place a bookmark, a folded index card I kept in my left shirt pocket, at the exact page I had been reading. It was a habit born from 20 years of losing my place in dense records. I knew precisely where I had been in any document at any given moment. I mention this because it matters. It matters a great deal. The other thing you need to know is that the Harwick Atheneum, when it was expanded in 1903, was funded almost entirely by a private family contribution. The family's name was Voss. I did not know that when I began my research there. I only found it in the building's original expansion deed, deep in the probate records collection, about 4 visits in. The deed referenced something unusual, a clause describing the purpose of the lower archive not as a place of storage or research, but as, and I'm quoting directly here, a place of collection. I noted it. I told myself it was old legal language. I moved on. That was my second mistake. The head librarian at the Harwick Atheneum was a man named Gerald Whitmore. He had worked there for 31 years when I met him. He was a quiet man, deliberate in his movements, precise in his speech, the kind of person who measures what he says before he says it. Gerald had given me after-hours research access, a key, a sign-in log, a direct phone number in case anything came up. The first time he handed me the key, he said something I noted but did not fully process at the time. He said, "Don't stay past 9. Not a question. Not a suggestion. Just that. I asked him once, about 2 visits in, why 9 specifically. He looked at the key in my hand for a moment and then he said, "The building settles after 9. It can be disorienting." I nodded. I thought I understood what he meant. I did not understand at all what he meant. The night everything changed, I stayed until 11:45. I was working through a set of probate records from 1887, following a land transfer involving a family named Calloway, a transfer that used language I had never encountered in any comparable document. The land had not been sold. It had not been inherited. It had been transferred under what the document called Terms of quietude. I was close to finding the full covenant attached to that transfer. 20 more minutes, I told myself. Just 20 more minutes. The overhead fluorescent light above my reading table gave off a low, constant hum that I had grown so used to I no longer consciously heard it. The smell of the lower archive was dry paper and cool stone and something faintly mineral, the way a very old basement smells after years of careful climate control. I was comfortable. I was focused. And then I heard the creak. From above me. One steady, rhythmic creak, like the sound of a rocking chair on an old wooden floor. Back and forth. Back and forth. Measured and slow. I stopped writing. I looked up at the ceiling, which was low and timber-beamed, and I listened. The creak continued. I told myself it was the pipes. That is what you tell yourself. Old buildings settle, old buildings breathe, old buildings make sounds that have perfectly reasonable explanations. I looked back down at my documents. I turned to retrieve a supplementary ledger from the filing cabinet against the far wall. I was gone from the reading table for maybe 3 minutes. When I came back, my bookmark was gone. Not fallen. Not slipped between pages. Gone. And the ledger I had been reading was open to a different page entirely. Not the page I had left it on. Not even the same section. It was open to a page near the back, in a part of the document I had not yet reached, and at the top of that page, in handwriting that did not match the surrounding entries, handwriting that looked somehow newer, somehow fresher, as if the ink had dried recently rather than a century ago, was a name I had never seen in any record I had ever reviewed. Voss. Below the name, in that same fresher-looking hand, was a single line of text. 7 words. Do not read past the margin. I stared at it for a long moment. I reached out and touched the edge of the page with one finger, the way you test whether a wound is real. The paper felt normal. Cool, slightly brittle with age, the way paper that old always feels. The ink did not smear. I looked around the room. I was alone. The door to the staircase was closed. The light above me hummed. The creak from the non-existent floor above me had stopped. I went back. Of course I went back. I want you to understand that at this point, I was not afraid. I was unsettled, yes. I was curious, absolutely. But fear requires you to believe that something is real, and I had not yet fully committed to believing what I had seen was real. I had, instead, constructed a very reasonable explanation involving my own fatigue and the kind of perceptual tricks that happen when you have been staring at tiny handwriting under fluorescent light for 6 hours. So I went back the following Thursday with a fresh index card bookmark, a thermos of coffee, and what I can only describe as an attitude. I was going to sit in that archive and work and nothing was going to happen because nothing had actually happened. I was wrong about that. Rule number 1: never sit with your back to the stacks. I learned the first rule on my second visit. I had set up at the central reading table with my back to the north wall, where the oldest collection lived, pre-1900 acquisitions, original bindings, spines worn soft as cloth. I was deep in the Voss notation, trying to cross-reference the name against every supplementary index one could find, when I felt it. Not a sound. A change. The way air moves when something displaces it, the way you feel in a room when another person enters even before you see or hear them. A displacement. I turned around. The aisle between the north shelving units was empty. But 3 books that had been pushed flush with the shelf edge, spines out and level, were now jutting forward. 3 inches each. Perfectly spaced. Perfectly aligned. Like someone had drawn 3 fingers slowly along that row of spines and pulled each one forward with precise, deliberate intention. I sat with my back to the wall from that visit onward. Rule number 2: do not speak aloud in the lower archive. I broke this rule on the same visit, and I broke it the way most rules get broken, not recklessly, but thoughtlessly. I had been searching for a specific follow-up document in the Callaway transfer records and I couldn't find it. I was frustrated. And I said, out loud, to no one, in a voice barely above a murmur, "Where is it?" 2 words. That is all it took. The overhead fluorescent light above my reading table went out. Not a flicker. Not a stutter. Off. Complete darkness except for the narrow beam of the small flashlight I kept in my bag. I stood very still. The smell of the archive changed. Something underneath the usual dry paper smell rose up, something damp and organic and deeply wrong, like wet soil in a sealed room. And from somewhere in that darkness, from a direction I could not locate, a direction that seemed to have no correlation to the physical dimensions of the space around me, I heard a sound. One long, slow exhalation. Deliberate. Human in shape but not in character. The kind of breath that suggests not breathing out but releasing something. Then the light came back on. When I reviewed the voice memo I had been recording on my phone, my voice asking the question was not on it. Only the response. Rule number 3: count the chairs before you sit down. Count them again when you stand up. 3rd visit. I had started counting things out of anxiety more than intention. The chairs at the central reading table, the books jutting from the north shelf, the steps from the archive door to my seat. Anxiety invents rituals. There were 4 chairs around the reading table when I arrived that evening. 4 chairs, I counted them, I sat in one. 2 hours into my work, I stood to retrieve a document from the filing cabinet on the far side of the room. I crossed the floor. I found the document. I turned back toward the table. There were 5 chairs. A 5th chair, slightly different from the others, the wood a shade darker, the style belonging to a slightly earlier era of manufacture, was pulled up to the table on the side nearest mine. Pushed just slightly back, the way a chair looks when someone has just stood up from it. I counted 4 times. 5 chairs. I did not sit back down that night. I gathered my materials, I walked to the staircase door, and I left. I did not run, because something in my understanding of that place told me that running would be interpreted as an acknowledgement. And I was not ready to acknowledge anything yet. Rule number 4: if a book opens itself, do not read what it shows you. I did not follow this rule. I need to own that. On my 4th visit, a thin volume appeared on the reading table. I say appeared because I know for a fact it was not there when I sat down. Cloth-bound, no title visible on the spine, the cover soft with age. It was lying open. The pages it was open to were handwritten in the same script I had seen in the Voss notation, that same quality of looking somehow newer than it should, that same sense of fresh intention in aged material. The text on those pages was a list. 12 names, numbered down the left margin. 11 names with full entries, first name, last name, and what appeared to be a date beneath each one. I recognized the 11th name. It was the name of a woman I had read about in a brief footnote in the Atheneum's own internal history documents, a researcher named Patricia Ann Marsh, who had used the lower archive in the summer of 1974 and who had died in the building that same summer. She was 31 years old. The official cause of death was listed as a cardiac event. She was a healthy woman with no documented history of heart disease. The 12th line on that list was blank. There was room for one more name. The handwriting left a careful, deliberate space, as if the list was nearly complete and waiting only for a final entry. I closed the book. My hands were shaking. I placed both palms flat on the table and breathed slowly and looked at the cover of that closed book and understood for the first time that something in this building was not haunting me. Something in this building was building toward me. Rule number 5: do not look at the door to the stairs after 10 o'clock. By the time I had identified the 5th rule, I had begun to understand that the rules were not random. They had a structure. They were protective in a specific, architectural way, the way the rules of a confined space are protective. They define what you must not do in order to remain safe within boundaries that something else has established. The door to the staircase in the lower archive, the door I entered through every visit, the door that led back up to the ground floor and the main building and the outside world, I had a habit of glancing at it. Old instinct. Situational awareness. After 10 o'clock on my 4th visit, every time my eyes drifted to that door, the temperature in the lower archive dropped sharply. Not a fluctuation. A drop. Immediate and significant, maybe 10 degrees in the space of a breath. I started timing it with my phone. I looked at the door, temperature dropped. I looked away, waited, temperature climbed back slowly over 2 or 3 minutes. Looked at the door again, dropped. Every single time. As if the door, or whatever was on the other side of it, or above it, or in that unaccounted space between floors, was aware of being watched. And did not want to be observed approaching. There was a 5th visit that, in retrospect, I should have recognized as the most dangerous of all precisely because of how safe it felt. I arrived on a bright, cold Saturday afternoon, which was unusual for me. I had always come on Thursdays. Gerald was there when I arrived, which was also unusual. He was at the circulation desk and he looked at me with something in his expression that I now recognize as relief. He said, "You're here early." I told him I needed to pick up where I had left off. He said, "Of course," and then, as I passed the desk, he said quietly, "Be back before it gets dark." I laughed. I was still able to laugh then. I sat at the reading table in the warm afternoon light that filtered through the ground floor windows above and I felt absolutely nothing wrong. The archive was just an archive. The smell was just old paper. The silence was just silence. I even talked to myself a little, which I had stopped doing after Rule 2, and nothing happened. I thought, I have been letting this consume me. I am a rational person. This is an old building with old plumbing and I have been working too hard and imagining things. I looked at the Callaway records with fresh eyes. I made real progress for the first time in weeks. I gathered my things when the light outside began to fade, feeling almost embarrassed by my earlier fear. I reached for my coffee cup to drain the last of it before I packed up. Underneath the cup, placed there at some point during those 2 comfortable, productive hours, was a small folded piece of paper. I had not left my seat. I had not seen anyone enter the archive. I was the only person with access that afternoon. I had confirmed this with Gerald on my way in. I unfolded the paper with steady hands, because by this point steadiness was something I had to deliberately maintain. The note was handwritten in 7 words. No greeting. No signature. 7 words in the same hand I had come to know over the previous weeks, that same ink that looked too fresh, too intentional. The note said, "You forgot Rule 6. I drove to Gerald Whitmore's house the next morning. Not to his office. His house. I had found the address in a local directory I kept for research contacts, and I sat outside for several minutes before I knocked, trying to organize myself. When he opened the door, he looked at me the way someone looks when they have been expecting a phone call that they hoped wouldn't come. He brought me inside. He made coffee. He sat across from me at his kitchen table, and I put the note on the table between us, and he looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he said, "You've been going on Thursdays." I said yes, almost every visit had been on a Thursday. He sat back slowly and pressed both palms flat on the table and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "Thursdays are the problem. I asked him what that meant. He said, "I should have told you before." I told myself you'd be fine. You're experienced. You know archives. I told myself it wouldn't notice you. I asked him what it was. He stood up and went to a shelf in his study and came back with a photograph. The photograph was black and white, printed on the thicker paper of the early 20th century, and it showed the interior of the lower archive of the Harwick Atheneum as it looked around 1902. The room was exactly as I knew it, same timber beams, same stone walls, same central reading table. But the table in the photograph had 12 chairs around it. And in one of those chairs, at the far end of the table, was a figure. The figure was seated, posture upright, hands resting on the table in front of it. The figure had the proportions of a person. But where the face should have been, there was only white. Not overexposed. Not damaged. The face was simply white. As if the face had refused to be recorded. As if whatever sat in that chair understood the photograph and declined to be seen in it. I looked at Gerald. I said, "Who is that?" He said, "That's what has always been there. That's what the Voss family built the building for. Not to house books. To house that." Gerald told me the rest in pieces, slowly, the way you dismantle something fragile. The Voss family was real but had been deliberately removed from all public record by a vote of the Providence County Municipal Council in 1902. Their name was struck from deeds, census records, property filings. The 1903 expansion of the Atheneum, funded entirely by the Voss estate, had included the addition of the lower archive and a structural element that no building plan Gerald had ever found explained, a cavity between the ground floor and the basement level, approximately 4 feet high, with no door, no ventilation, no visible means of access, and no documented purpose. The Voss family had called this element in their own private correspondence, letters Gerald had found tucked inside a false backing in the building's original deed box, the listening space. And the thing I had not understood, the thing that reframed every single visit, every single encounter, every rule I had stumbled my way into, was this: the building had not been haunting me. It had been studying me. Every rule I had triggered and navigated was a test of my awareness, my precision, my capacity for attention. The thing in the Harwick Atheneum did not want to frighten people away. It wanted to find someone worth keeping. And I had passed every test. Gerald looked at me across that kitchen table and said something I have turned over in my mind every single day since. He said, "I've been in that building for 31 years and I have never once felt anything. Not once. Because I never go in alone. I never go in alone and I never stay past 9. Then he said, "How many times have you seen another researcher in the lower archive?" I thought about it. In all my visits, with access shared between myself and 2 other approved researchers, all that time in the building, I had never crossed paths with a single one of them. Not once. Not even on the Saturday afternoon visit when I had felt so safe. Gerald set his coffee cup down and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I went back one final time. I know. I hear myself say that and I understand how it sounds. But I had left something in the lower archive. My grandfather's annotated copy of a 19th century New England surveying guide, a book he had carried through 40 years of fieldwork, every margin filled with his handwriting, every page a record of how he had thought and worked and understood the land he spent his life measuring. Irreplaceable. Entirely personal. I had been using it as a reference on the Callaway deed and I had left it on the reading table on my last visit. Gerald was not at the building when I arrived. I had not called ahead. I told myself I would be inside for 5 minutes. In and out. Pick up the book, walk back out. Simple. The building was unlocked, public hours ran until 6, and it was just past 6:15 when I pulled open the front door and stepped into the main hall. The ground floor was empty. Still. The last of the evening light came through the high windows in flat, colorless planes. I crossed the floor toward the door marked staff only and opened it and started down the wooden staircase into the lower archive. The smell hit me before I reached the bottom step. The lower archive always smelled of dry paper and cool stone. That was its character, its constant. But that evening it smelled of wet earth. Of turned soil. The smell of a garden after heavy rain, thick and organic and deeply wrong in an enclosed stone space where nothing grew and no moisture should have been present. I reached the bottom of the stairs. The overhead lights were off. I turned on my flashlight and swept it across the room. The reading table. The filing cabinets. The north shelving wall. Everything where it should be. My grandfather's book, exactly where I had left it, on the table near the north end. I crossed to the table. I picked up the book. I held it with both hands and felt a relief so physical it was almost dizzying. I turned to leave. I stopped. Because the fifth chair was at the table. Not simply present, it had been there before on my third visit. But now it was pulled fully out from the table, the way a chair looks when someone has just vacated it in a hurry, or has stood up and left the room seconds before you entered. And on the table in front of that chair was the cloth-bound handwritten volume, open. Open to the page with the 12 names. I did not want to look. I looked. 11 names with their entries. And on the 12th line, where the blank space had waited for so long, was my name. My full name, first and last, written in that now familiar hand, in ink that I could see even from where I stood had not fully dried. The ink was still wet. I reached out and touched it. I don't know why. The same instinct that had made me touch the page before, the need to confirm reality through physical contact. My fingertip pressed against my own name. The ink smeared. Dark. Brownish red in the beam of my flashlight, a color I tried immediately not to think too hard about. I stepped back from the table. I picked up my grandfather's book again from where I had set it down. I turned toward the staircase door. And the lights went out. This darkness was not the same as the darkness on my second visit. That darkness had been the absence of light. This darkness was something else. This darkness had a quality, a texture, a presence. It pressed against my skin. It had weight. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears and in my fingertips, and I stood very still and breathed very carefully and told myself, flashlight. I reached for my flashlight. It was in my hand. I turned it on. The beam came on and I moved it toward the staircase. And from above me, from the non-existent floor, the creak of the rocking chair began. But it was not above me. It was beside me. It was at the same level as the archive floor, moving through the stone wall on my left as if the wall were a suggestion rather than a fact, and it was getting closer. I moved toward the staircase. I want to tell you I walked calmly and deliberately. What I actually did was cross that room faster than I have ever moved in my life and hit the staircase door with both hands and pull it open and start up the stairs. The stairs were wrong. I had counted them on my way down. 9 steps from the door to the archive floor. When I went back up, I counted them because counting was something my hands and feet could do while my mind was somewhere else entirely. 17 steps. The staircase was longer going up than it had been coming down, each step placing another step ahead of it, the door to the ground floor visible at the top but not getting closer, the way distance behaves in certain kinds of dreams. I kept moving. I climbed every step the staircase invented. And eventually, I cannot tell you how much time passed, the door was in front of me. I pushed it open. I crossed the ground floor of the Harwick Atheneum at a pace that was not quite running because I was not going to run, I was not going to give whatever was behind me the satisfaction of seeing me run. I reached the front door. I gripped the handle. Pushed. It did not move. I pushed harder. Locked. The front door of the Harwick Atheneum, which has no interior lock, I know this, I have used that door dozens of times, was locked from within. I turned around. I had to turn around. I stood with my back against the locked door and looked into the reading room of the main floor. And standing in the center of that room, between me and the staircase door I had just come through, was a shape. The proportions were approximately those of a person. Upright, still, arms at the sides, at the height of a person. But the face, the photograph. Gerald's photograph. That is what came to me instantly, that image of the white face that would not be recorded. This was that. The face was white. Not pale. Not obscured. White in the way that a page is white. Absolute and intentional. The shape did not move. It stood there and it was aware of me in a way that had no uncertainty in it, no question about what I was or why I was there. It had been aware of me for a very long time. I stood against that door for what felt like several minutes. And then the door opened. Behind me, without my turning the handle, without any sound of a lock disengaging. Just, open. Cold November air hit the back of my neck. I stepped backward through the doorway without taking my eyes off the shape in the center of the room. 1 step. 2. My right hand found the door frame. I gripped it. And I felt something against my hand. Not a grip. A pressure. Deliberate, aware, measured. Like a hand resting on mine. Like something noting the specific texture of my exit. Like something memorizing the feeling of me leaving so it would know the exact difference when I came back. I did not come back. I stepped off the porch and I walked to my car in the parking lot and I drove away. Gerald told me Rule 6 the next morning at his kitchen table, after he opened the door at 7 in the morning to find me standing on his porch, shaking in a way I could not control, my grandfather's book pressed against my chest with both arms. Gerald sat across from me and said, "When you leave that building, do not look back at it. Not once. Not for any reason. Not at the windows, not at the door, not even a glance over your shoulder." He said, "If it sees you looking back, it knows you are not finished. It knows you are still connected. And it will wait." He said this the way you say something to a person who has very nearly not made it home. Quiet and complete and without any room for argument. I had looked back. I could not help it. From the parking lot, I turned and looked at the building the way you look at something you are trying to decide is real. One glance. One moment. I looked at the window of the lower archive, the single window, the one that was always dark, set into the stone foundation just above ground level. There was a light in that window. Amber. Warm. The exact color of a reading lamp. And in the amber light, visible through the glass, was a silhouette. Seated at the reading table. Still. Upright. Reading. Gerald Whitmore retired 6 months after that morning. He called me to tell me, and I asked him what he was going to do and he said he was going to move to his daughter's place in Vermont and never set foot in an archive again. I asked if there was someone he was going to tell about the building, about the rules, about the thing in the lower archive and the unaccounted space between the floors. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I've been telling myself someone official would handle it eventually. I've been telling myself that for 31 years. Then he said goodbye. That was the last time I heard from him. I've tried to call twice since. The number no longer connects. The Callaway research, The research that put me in that building in the first place, that kept me going back, that gave me reasons to stay past 9 on a Thursday night in November, I have not been able to finish it. I have tried to continue using documents obtained by mail and scanned copies and second-hand references. But there is always a gap. The specific document I need, the full covenant attached to the terms of quietude in the Callaway land transfer, exists only in the physical collection of the Harwick Atheneum. In the lower archive. Behind the door marked staff only. That document is down there. It is on a shelf or in a filing drawer in a room I will not enter again. And I have made my peace with not knowing the end of that particular story. Some records are kept from you for reasons you do not get to choose. My grandfather's annotated surveying guide is also still in that building. I reached for it when I fled up those impossible stairs. I had it in my hands on the archive floor. I was gripping it against my chest when I pushed through the front door. But somewhere in the parking lot, standing in the cold staring at the light in the basement window, I realized my hands were empty. I had dropped it. On the stairs, I think. Those extra stairs that should not have existed. It is down there still. His handwriting is down there. 40 years of his thoughts and observations and marginal notes, in his unmistakable hand, the hand that is in my blood and in my own writing style whether I intend it or not. I think about that book. Late at night, I think about what he wrote in it, about the kind of focused, loving, solitary silence he must have worked in when he filled those margins. I think about the thing in the Harwick Atheneum and its preference for that quality of attention. I think about whether, in that listening space between the floors, something reads by amber light in a quiet that has weight and presence and intention. And whether, in some way I cannot name and do not fully want to name, my grandfather's words have found the most attentive reader they have ever had. I want to close with something that took me a long time to understand about this experience. The rules in the Harwick Atheneum are not arbitrary. They are not the scattered prohibitions of a random haunting. They are a system. A coherent set of boundaries that define a relationship between the thing in that building and the people who enter it. Follow the rules and the building tolerates you. Break enough rules thoughtlessly and you become interesting. Become interesting enough and your name goes on a list that has been accumulating since at least 1887. Patricia Ann Marsh was 31 years old. She was a careful person, a researcher, someone who understood silence. The same things that Gerald believed would protect me. The rules were never designed to keep you safe from what is in that building. I need you to hear this clearly, because it is the thing that matters most. The rules keep you manageable. The rules keep you within boundaries that define the hunt. They are there because a thing that collects attention, that feeds on the specific quality of focused solitude, needs its subjects present long enough to be fully known. The rules are not there to keep you safe. They're there to keep it patient. If you have made it this far with me, thank you. Genuinely. These stories take something out of me every time I tell them. But they need to be told. They need to be heard. I want to ask you something, and I want a real answer in the comments below. If you had known all 6 rules before you ever walked into the Harwick Atheneum, do you honestly believe you could have followed every single one of them? Every time. Under those lights, in that silence, with that smell in the air and something rocking back and forth in a room that should not exist. Because I have asked myself that question more times than I can count. And I am still not sure of my own answer. If something in this story felt familiar to you, if you have ever been in a place that felt like it was watching you more carefully than the room deserved, tell me about it below. I read every comment. Every single one. Subscribe to EchoCrypt Nightmare Tales. New stories every week.